And get us started. I just wanted to thank everybody for being here for the Legal Aid Society of Palm Beach County's presentation on Section 8, Fair Housing for Landlords. This is a presentation made possible by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, who sponsors our program. And we're excited to bring you this event today because April is Fair Housing Month. We've had a series of great events so far over the course of the month, and this is the final or second to last event. We have another session with our speaker Jay later this afternoon for tenants. This presentation is going to be geared primarily towards landlords. But we are very excited to bring you this Fair Housing Month event, and we hope it's informative and we hope you get a lot out of it. I want to take a minute to introduce our speaker, Jay Roulet of Section8Consulting.com. Jay is a Section 8 expert with 20 years of experience and an excellent success rate of working with tenants and landlords and getting people into low-income housing and helping them navigate the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Jay's Section 8 consulting experience is quite extensive. It includes reading thousands of housing authority and continuum of care manuals, covering everything from Section 8 housing applications, operations, policies, procedures, assessment tools, HIMS, algorithmic ranking, data manuals, and every piece of HUD and housing legislation written on subsidized housing in the last decade. As a Section 8 consultant, he's had the pleasure of serving thousands of low-income housing landlords and Section 8 applicants in every state of the U.S., including Florida, right here at home. He has worked as both a consultant and a district manager at many of the best affordable housing properties on the market. His greatest honor and privilege has been serving the thousands of homeless, disabled seniors and veterans who need this housing most. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jay. If you have any questions, please go ahead and drop them in the question and answer box. We'll have Jay speak for about 45 minutes or so, and then save 10 or 15 minutes at the end for question and answer. And so with that, I will turn it over to Jay.
Thank you, Jacob. So as you all know, today's I'm all about fair housing, and what I would like to do is kind of give an overview of the subject matter we're going to be covering today, and it's going to be primarily an overview of Section 8 and the duties to tenants under Section 8, duties with HUD to maintain Section 8 status, obligations under FHA, and the benefits of being a Section 8 landlord. There will also be a brief summary for COVID-19 and how to navigate that. I do realize that we're not strictly in the pandemic anymore, but there are certainly after effects on the market that are going to affect that for both landlords and tenants. So, all right, I want to talk to you just briefly as the overview for Section 8. So Section 8 is the Housing Act of the 1937 U.S. 42 Code, and it's for low-income housing assistance. According to at least to HUD, the Section 8 has existed under its voucher program, was established under 1974 Housing and Community Development Act. The Housing Choice Program is better known as Section 8, is the federal government's major program for assisting the very low-income families, elderly, disabled, and to provide safe, decent, and affordable housing for those that meet the program requirements. That being said, most of the participants are able to find, housing and vouchers. And one of the things that I think that I was hoping to kind of cover in here is just briefly some of the types of housing that will be corresponding with the program itself. As many of you know, PHAs or public housing authorities carry public housing. They also have subsidized housing, and they have project-based housing. And then there's also other programs that are including continuum of care and housing first programs that may assist those that are homeless, HUD-VASH for veterans. And so those are the kind of programs that we're going to be kind of talking about in the video today. So landlord responsibilities is a big issue. A lot of people have published content regarding this matter. And as many of you know, with Section 8 and HUD, policies rapidly change. And this course has been over an 80-year period. And it's a lot like a cake where you keep adding layer after layer of policies and rules. And as many of you may not know, most public housing authorities may be privately owned or owned by the city. That means that functionally their policies and procedures are underwritten by companies like Nana McKay. And that means that each PHA may operate under different policies. That means different responsibilities. So the landlord or owner as a participant in the Section 8 program is a responsibility or for the provision to afford essentially decent, safe, and sanitary housing to tenants at a reasonable rent. And that goes into what we call FMRs or SAMPARs, small area market rates and standard market rates. With that, one of the requirements is a housing quality inspection or HQS. And those standards must be maintained through this process. I know in the inception of Section 8 in most housing authorities, the quality inspection was to help kind of get away from the old days of running slummy properties and properties that weren't meeting the basic quality criterias. A lot like when you dove back into the 1930s and the 40s and 50s, many of the properties were rather quite dangerous in some situations. So, all right. Besides the housing quality inspection, as a landlord, you'll need to complete an application, clearly. Now, one of the big parts that confuse people is whether or not these applications have to do with you being an established business or whether or not it's just an established way to do business with your local PHA. I would suggest to you that any individual that owns a property that could meet a housing quality inspection would absolutely be able to accept payments on behalf of the housing authority, and that in most cases, those payments can be rendered to the landlords, usually within 30 days. Now, outside of that assistance payment, the tenant obviously would be responsible for up to 30%, but that's where we go kind of digress into landlords not only being able to accept a client and then utilize that voucher to receive 70% payment, but that 30% they'd be responsible for. And that changes if they don't have a voucher. Now, one that carries a voucher from a housing authority is a lot different than those of you that may be utilizing programs that are funded by subsection 811. A lot of you have heard of section 811. That is not a voucher, but rather a property designation that receives federal funds. And it's a lot like tenant-based housing, where it's not a voucher, but the funding and the people that are allowed in the building. So section 811 would be more along the lines of a person that is 18 to 61 that's disabled. So I'll try not to digress too much because there's a lot to be said, obviously, about every subject matter. But the housing assistance payments, which better known as HAP, is another issue that most of you must focus on as a landlord, because when you have a tenant that is carrying a voucher, it's really called an RFTA, which is a request for tenancy. That acronym may change depending on the department, depending on the part of the country you're dealing with, but most it's just a request for tenancy, and that will prescribe whether or not a tenant's going to pay a certain amount. And that request for tenancy will also name the number of rooms the property may have, and I believe beyond that, request for tenancy, it's going to indicate the amount in which you would be able to get in rent. That under the request for tenancy, you should also keep an account for other issues related to the tenancy addendum. That addendum is in place basically to ensure that not only are we following, and we're not discriminating and creating other issues with federal law, but with the approval, it means that you would be able to pass the housing quality inspection. The amendments would have built-in policies that are both met by federal and state laws, as well as other gregarious activities that a tenant may cause you. Many of you have watched the news over the years, and you've seen a lot of horrifying situations where your property is being torn up. Look, that doesn't have to happen, and a lot of what is viewed fundamentally over the years from news agencies is not always reality. Many tenants wait for vouchers over a decade or longer, And then, of course, the search to actually get the housing is very difficult. And I would suggest to you that anybody that's going through all of those processes isn't going to merely go through all of that and then show up at your property to rent and then go and tear everything up. So I think those are exceptional cases, and you shouldn't be too worried. And if you're building the right addendums in there to ensure that they understand that they're not throwing out trash, not damaging the building, that we're not going to have strange people arriving on the property or living in the property at all hours. Those addendums are critical to your success in dealing with your tenants, so they have an understanding from the very beginning that fundamentally you're not going to tolerate activities that would make it miserable for both you or the other tenants in place. One bad tenants can run off other tenants, clearly. All right, so beyond the HAP contract securing you a deal essentially with the housing authority to fund their voucher, and then of course that probably would go against your mortgage if you have one. That HAP contract also has some things that are built into it that would protect both you and the tenant, especially when there are things that can be considered in the realm of harassment or discrimination. And I'm only going to speak on that subject matter lightly because it requires an extensive knowledge, and you would be probably better off speaking with an attorney when it comes to all the different federal laws that deal with that. Okay. All right. I think we did the Tennessee addendums and then the request for taxpayer identification. That goes back to some of the first policy. Taxpayer identifications, you're establishing yourself as an actual business and that you're going to accept payments from the PHA or Public Housing Authority as a business rather than a person. Again, anybody that owns a property outright that's not subleasing could enter into a HAP contract. You do not need a business. You do not need a business checking account. You don't even need a DBA. You just need to be able to meet the terms of the HAP contract. I'm going to take a sip of coffee and then we're going to move on to the inspection checklist. All right, so every property is going to require a minimum maintenance and to make sure certain parts of the property are in good condition. And so one thing that I'm hoping to do for those of you that may not know this is a little bit later in this video, I'm going to kind of connect you with a housing quality inspection manual and a housing quality inspection checklist. I'll have to figure out where it is, and then when I do in this video, I'll definitely issue it to you guys. Now, there are many other forms that you're going to be dealing with. As a landlord, one of the first things that you'll likely be addressing is a landlord's packet. That means you're showing interest to the housing authority as a landlord, and you're not sure about that process to become a landlord, and you may have a lot of misinformation related to that subject matter. So a landlord's packet is commonly what they refer to, and you may find that linkage possibly on your local housing authority in your county. If they don't have it, then I would say contacting them and ask them for landlord information or a packet would be a good move. Why? Because it's going to have a lot of forms, because not only are you becoming a landlord, but many of the issues that may arise, there are specific forms you can fill out that would probably greatly expedite your ability to do whatever action is required. And in this case, you may request a time extension to correct housing quality inspection deficiencies. In other words, if you have a lot of broken, damaged, or unqualified things going on in the unit and it needs to be repaired, and then that would allow that, and having that form ready to go is a good idea. A sample notification of contract termination. Not all situations between you and that of the landlord, you being the landlord, are always going to work out. And if you don't have the option and you don't want to utilize the option to evict, then I would suggest that the easiest way for both parties to settle those type of disagreements would be a non-renewal, which means it's a legal way for both of you to exit the agreement and the tenancy, and there not be any negative activity against either party. Outside of that, I would say that you could also issue a 30-day notice to vacate. And so that form would also be useful for you as a landlord. You know, if you're able to come to an amicable solution, then a 30-day notice, and then you discuss your deposits, and that would allow you kind of out of that agreement. Disclosure of information on lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards, which is pretty much a nationwide issue and is a mandate by HUD. If you believe, and I would suggest to you that if you have a property reaching from the 70s or lower, there's a potential for that. I've had people ask, can you paint over it or can you have to replace the sheetrock? I'm not an expert in that area, but I would suggest that probably painting over, but again, that is an opinion rather than a factual way to deal with it. So I would say you would want to look into that for sure. A notice or intent to vacate or move. Now, there are lots of reasons in which a landlord would have a tenant that may need to vacate or move, and it's not always because it's bad. Sometimes people have medical health problems. Maybe you live in a small town in Iowa where there's just a few cornfields, and then that would allow the tenant to be able to move and there not be a big disagreement about it because they need to be closer to doctors or professionals, or there are other reasons. Maybe the building burned down and they need to move for that particular reason. Now, after passing the housing quality inspection, HQI, HQS, once the inspector improves your property, you can begin accepting requests for tenancy, which is another really neat word of saying that you're accepting the client, you've checked them out, and now that you're going to begin accepting payments. One thing I want to tell you very quickly about the housing inspection is this. A lot of you have it in your mind, this is a lot of money, and it's a big deterrent for a lot of landlords, but it's not always the reality of the situation. Most of the things that housing quality inspections identify are small deficiencies. You've got windows with no screens, you've got a door that's got a big crack to let all the cool air in, you may not have base plates on your socket. So it's not always the big life-changing things or costs that are associated in there. So I would say that, being pleasant with the person doing the inspection, and most of these inspectors are housing authority employees, they're by no means trained to the level of a normal housing inspector. Just think of it as a minor inspection to ensure that the property's in good standing. And again, things, it's usually gonna be minor stuff, but if you don't really want to fail outright, you definitely want to go through the house and make sure there's no pests, roaches, rats, or even droppings. Okay. Every cabinet, every space needs to be, evaluated. Moving on from that, monitoring tenant landlord compliance with rules. It is absolutely the obligation of the landlord to ensure that and again, this may seem a bit comical when I say it this way, but I want to express the true intent. Okay. You can't have people out there that are running a brothel out of your property. You cannot have people that have taken over the property and they're gang members. You cannot have a property where you have people that may not have a firm grip of reality. They're roaming around the property, damaging cars and breaking in and all those other things. It is your responsibility, if the tenant is actually violating the law and other issues, that you're quick to report those things directly to your local PHA that you have your HAP contract with, and that you come to an equitable situation where you either terminate or warn. It's important that all tenants that you're dealing with, that you're giving 1 to 3 warnings if possible, and you always keep a matter of record when it comes to that, because you don't want to get involved with a tenant and then all of a sudden you're tabulating this in your mind, all the offenses, but there is no evidence of this, so don't be overzealous, but I mean, if there's activity that doesn't belong there, then it is your absolute responsibility and contract to ensure that you're reporting this. Reinspection, the units and the period basis. Let's talk about that. So that's annual inspections. Typically, it's actually about every 2 years, but you may find that some housing authorities that aren't so busy will do it every 6 months, sometimes a year. But I think the golden standard is around 2 years. These inspections are to ensure that you haven't lost control of the property. The tenant may have not reported a water leak, and then you got, the ceiling caving in. So they're going to come out, and then whatever they request is the requirement you must meet. If you're not willing to meet the requests for repairs and other issues, then they'll likely terminate the agreement and you won't further be paid. So we're going to go into example standards of housing and requirements. And I'm going to take a sip of coffee because I'm off to a fiery start and I'm already burning out the juices. So we have standard housing requirements. Then some of these got some common sense, and I've actually made a list just so I can remember because there's many of them. So all properties must have a kitchen. If you own a property that's going to be more like a hotel, and you're going to have that hotel with little kitchenettes and a hot plate and a microwave, and you got 60 rooms, then you must have a sub-designated kitchen area for each floor and so many tenants. But for most of you, you're dealing with single family properties and multifamily property. So in that case, just have a good working, decent kitchen with all the cabinet doors on it, all the knobs working. And again, no pests and droppings and other things that are in there. Check. Because I always tell the real estate agents, they take beautiful pictures, but they rarely looking at these cabinets and you get ready to lease, that could be a big problem. It must have a bathroom and everything must be functional and working there. Living room and sleeping room. Let's make two distinctions. Some states do consider your living room can be considered an additional room. That's going to become to the great disappointment of many of you, especially in certain parts of Florida and California. In other words, the housing quality inspection, and they'll come out there and they'll happily give you a dollar store sheet to hang. The congratulations, you now have a 3-bedroom apartment. Now but that's a double-edged sword, because if you can consider the living room a sleeping room, that means you've got an additional room, which means you'd qualify for a higher FMR or fair market rate. So while it's funny, it does allow you, because the way they made that policy, it benefits you more than it does actually the tenant. Adequate ventilation, heating, and cooling systems with a seal of approval label. No Amazon appliances that are hot off the market. We need to have energy efficient equipment, and a lot of people ask me about not only the type of equipment and amenities, but the amenities that you're going to supply are not going to greatly affect the outcomes of rents. Okay, if you got a brand new property and everything looks good, then you're likely going to be able to rent the property at the top FMR or fair market rate offered. Even if it's an older property in solid condition, the condition is not based on how pretty it looks. The condition is based on whether or not the property is fundamentally damaged. So you could have the world's ugliest home from the 40s with mint green everything, not to suggest that's ugly, or Pepto-Bismol pink cabinets. That doesn't matter. It matters that these things function and that they're solid and they work properly. Okay. So outdated does not necessarily mean you're going to lose any value on FMRs. Outside doors and windows. If you live in the southern states, you're probably going to be required to have screens, and all windows must be able to lock or have latches, and on each exterior window. Safe approved water supply. If you've purchased a property and you're on a well system, then that is going to need to be inspected. Sometimes people install wells for anywhere from $5,000 to $20,000, sell the property and it's 20 years old and it's not functioning properly. You're pulling water, and that can be an issue. Okay, so that needs to be properly worked. Fire escape or outside windows that open in case of a fire, one in each sleeping area. That rule is not always held up to the test of time. What is sufficient is making sure you have a back door and a front door to get out of. It depends on the state and community in which whether or not they're going to make a big issue in relation to windows opening, and so you can get out. I don't know, most people don't jump out the window unless it's necessary. We must also understand that many people live in high rises, and these skyscrapers do not have a way to open windows. So that rule is somewhat bendable. An entrance without going through another person's property. That would be a situation likely to arise in New York, Jersey, potentially in some other areas like Chicago. It cannot be a shared property where you have a door. So, and that also for those of you that own the hotels that used to have the old shared doors from the 60s and 50s, that's not permitted. You'll need to seal that completely off. No dangerous gas or air pollution. So if you're running heavy equipment and so on. And I want to bring up one additional thing. Many of you are attempting to rent properties where you have your personal equipment and gardens and other things out there, and you think you can keep arriving on that property. If you rent something to somebody, a home for the yard, you're not going to be able to store all your used cars and everything out there. The property is being in whole, rented in whole to that owner. You're not going to be able to store all your personal business out there or come drive by every day to do your garden. Leasing the property means just that. No rodents, rats, mice, or vermin. That's the quickest way to mess this up as a landlord. You must maintain that at all times and show a record that you're doing that. Again, droppings and other issues, or bite holes and gaps in the home around plumbing and other issues is a quick way to fail this. And you really don't want to attract that kind of attention, because PHAs can go on for a while as a housing authority to continue to want you to do this, and it can get expensive. So I would say solve your rodent problems before the housing quality inspection, so you don't get locked into a monthly deal for years and years. Bathrooms must have at least one indoor toilet, one basin, which must have hot and cold water, exhaust ventilation, or outside windows that open. Kitchens must have at least a stove and a refrigerator. Now, the cubic foot of the refrigerator is completely contingent on you, but there must be at minimum, I would think, at least 3 cubic feet per both the refrigerator. The stove, whatever, gas or electric, as long as it meets proper code for either gas or electric. Adequate storage and preparation and servicing space. I've seen a lot of situations where people renovate and they tear out the islands in the kitchen. You must make sure that your kitchen has a proper preparation and serving space there. You can't simply rip out these islands and not have any cabinet space. If there's nowhere to prepare food, then that would be a problem. Garbage cans must be an issue that must be addressed. You own those trash cans, but you must provide them if that's a requirement for them to throw their trash out. Also, that's an addendum you'd want to do as well, because you don't really want people stacking trash bags out in the yard. Okay, it's not very pretty. Overhead or wall light or other electrical outlets, all those need to be functional. You need to go by and pull every switch, light switch, plug in a small fan or light into every socket, make sure it's working. And here's the key word: all appliances provided must be working. You cannot go and provide a working washer with no dryer. If you don't have both working, or you don't have either or, don't unplug it, disconnect it completely, and then at HQS tell them you have somebody come by to get the stuff. Don't offer it unless it completely works and you have both units. Living and sleeping rooms must have at least one window, 2 electrical outlets, and 1 overhead or wall outlet. No loose surface or materials. And the building must be in good conditions. Floors, no bulging holes or cracks. That includes indoors and also the stepping area going in and out the home. No loose surface materials, walls, no leaning, buckling, and loose siding. Okay, so they are interested in the outside of the home, because if the siding's loose, it means that there's a fundamental problem with insulation. Firm and water, it must be firm and watertight. No large cracks or holes. Okay, so we went over that part. Entrance, walkways, stairways, halls, and porches must have a doorknob, lock, or key deadbolt on each exterior door. Sliding door must pin the door handle, latch, or security bar on each exterior door. Keyless bolting device or door viewer on each extended door and peephole. There must be no danger of tipping or falling. Now, if you're going to accept, let's talk about this briefly. If you're going to accept people that have disabilities, whether physical or mental, then you need to make the appropriations if they require handles in the bathroom and so on. Do not accept tenants and then not be able to meet compliance with the American Disability Act. Then again, you need to read through that a bit. If you're not aware, you're required by law to do what is reasonable, as long as it doesn't create a gigantic administrative burden or a great financial burden. In other words, you're trying to fundamentally change the entire structure. Otherwise, you should pick a tenant that would be suitable for the property if you're not willing to meet those. If a tenant does rent there and they have disabilities, then you're going to have to, with reason, try to make some modifications or come some type of agreement. Okay. All right, I'm going to take another sip of coffee because that was a long run there. Now let's talk about fair housing. I know this is the part that the Legal Aid Society was most interested in, and we're going to go over that a little bit. First thing I want to point to is with the Fair Housing Act, you need to understand definitely when it comes to issues, there are a lot of ways to address them, including calling HUD's regional offices, HUD's hotline, OIG. Other issues may be related to FHEO, which is fair housing. Okay. Some cases can be deferred to the Department of Justice, and many, many more extenuating factors. For many states, fair housing means that you may be able to address these issues from the Attorney General for that state. Getting into the Fair Housing Act, and the Fair Housing Act is going to be under 42 U.S.C. 3601, prohibits discrimination by direct providers of housing, such as landlords and real estate companies, as well as other entities such as municipalities, banks, and other lending institutions, homeowners, and their insurance companies. Let me make something very clear. Many people have tried to dodge this by offering different types of properties, thinking that if they were sub-managed and other things, they would have to meet these rules, whether at the federal or state level. Don't make that mistake. they made these rules, they're in place. You're not going to dodge them, and it will be a problem if you decide that you're going to try to circumvent them. Okay. It's best if you want to be a landlord and be a good one to do so. But because let me tell you, any person that's carrying a voucher, I won't say that they have special federal protections, but there are certainly federal laws there to assist. You cannot run this property and be a landlord and treat it like a market rate tenant, which means a person without a voucher with a job. Now, it's not saying you need to go through extraordinary lengths. I'm just suggesting that if you're going to be a good landlord, do that. If you're not, then maybe this would not be the best situation, because you can't just rent any old property any old way. It needs to meet at least basic standards. And I don't think that's a lot to ask for those of you that want to do this honestly. So discrimination is in many forms, including race, color, national origin, family status, disabilities. And let's be very clear about disabilities. There are many times people that struggle with drugs, alcohol, if they struggle with their mental health, bipolar, schizophrenia, their physical health, whether they're old and have disabilities, or whether they're in a wheelchair, or maybe they're on spectrum, they have autism. All of these people are considered under a disability status. And as such, you must respect that. You cannot just deny them simply because you don't favor or you feel that their wheelchair is going to damage your property. Let me tell you another thing to use your mind when it comes to disabilities and other modifications. Many housing authorities will offer as an incentive to be able to cover damages. Now, I'm not suggesting every PHA in America is going to do that for you, but what I am suggesting is many of them do offer incentives to cover damages along the way. It's important to discover what incentives are being offered by your PHA, and that will mitigate some of your costs, especially those of you that are super concerned about your ROI, or return on investment. All right, so another thing is we're going to talk about discrimination based on disability group homes. There are many situations you may run a property that is kind of like a group home, where you may have a small property where you have many elderly living there, or it may be a group home for those that may be on spectrum or developmental delays. You don't want to discriminate on that. Actually, it's a good chance for you to do something for the community. And again, the same thing is inclusionary for those that are HUD-VASH or veterans. We always want to serve our veterans as well. All right, another sip of coffee, and then we'll move on to another part. The Fair Housing Act describes discrimination housing against persons with a disability is to include failure to design and construct certain new multi-home family dwellings so that they are accessible. There are lots of neat and clever ways to talk about rules and policies and code of federal regulation. But I think the truest intent is, when it comes to accessibility, you can't simply have somebody rent your property wheelchair and then offer them a flight of stairs. Okay, let's be reasonable. Anybody that's utilizing voucher should have an equal opportunity to rent the property. In some cases, what you're going to find is actually dealing with people that have disabilities and require a small modification may be a very good choice. Why? Because they've already dealt with so many obstacles with landlords not wanting to. That means this tenant's likely to stay much longer. Those of you that have been a landlord on the open market with people just normal jobs and no voucher, you're seeing a turnover rate every 2, 3, maybe 5 years. Those with disabilities and those that are seniors, their turnover rate's much lower, 10, 20, and sometimes even lifetime. That means you have virtually no flippage on the property and no loss of money. So it's actually an advantage to consider those that are elderly and disabled as much longer term tenants. And they're less likely to do anything in the property that would be egregious or damaged. And so that's one of those things I think that it's a really good, it coalesces with fair housing, because if you truly understand the type of people that are trying to come to your property, that you find that it's a greater benefit to you. Going on from there, the act requires all newly constructed family multi-dwellings of 4 or more units intended for, and this again was the loophole many are using to evade rules. And I'm going to go back to that briefly. The act requires all newly constructed family dwellings of 4 or more units. Do not use that to elude the law. Seen people try to do this. Oh, well, I've only got 3.5 units. No, don't try that. Okay. It most certainly will end up in some type of court battle. Moving on from there, it says that the units intended for the first occupancy after March 13th, 1991 to have certain features accessible on entrance or the accessible route. Accessibility is common to public use areas and doors sufficiently wide to accommodate wheelchairs, accessible routes into and throughout each dwelling, and of course, light switches and electrical outlets. Let me explain what all that means real quick. I'm not suggesting that you need to open up your checkbook and completely modify your property in order to accept a disabled person in a wheelchair. Most wheelchairs will fit through a standard door, okay? Unless you have a really old property. And most people that have a paraplegic or quadriplegic or have MS or MD, which is multiple sclerosis and other issues, they don't always require you to have to modify all the outlets to go up or down, okay? I think that it's good just to interview the people that will be potential tenants and see whether or not there could be an agreement there. And then you could end up in a 10-year lease, okay? Which is good for you, you know? All right. The benefits of being a Section 8 landlord. This is the part I love the most because I don't really need to read from notes. I deal with this obviously enough with around 800 to 1,000 clients a year. First benefit of being a Section 8 landlord. Let's take a look at the pandemic. What happened during the pandemic? A lot of landlords, a lot of good juicy properties out there, and a lot of people with jobs. And the pandemic forced anywhere. Well, I'm going to give a bold number that almost up to 40 million people were evicted in this nation during the pandemic, during its stretch. Those landlords that all had all job payers, they were most heavily affected, and many of which were living day to day just to get the mortgage paid. And so a lot of landlords lost their property. Had they diversified or had vouchers, they would have went unscathed. My point being here is Uncle Sam's check, which is essentially what that voucher is, you're going to be able to survive an immense amount of adversity because unlike your job, people that are working jobs, it's going to allow you to have a tenant that's always going to have 70% of their rent without any problems. And for those of you that consider those that are disabled and receive disability, social security checks, and even survivor benefits, it essentially means they have 2 government checks, okay? And in that respect, it means that your loss ratio of a tenant actually not being able to pay the rent is so low that it's negligible at that point.